This lecture is titled Short Stories by Indian Women Writers, and the lecture is divided into three parts. Part 1 deals with the tradition of storytelling amongst women, and as you recall, in the last lecture we have talked about specific examples. In the second part, we will talk about modern Indian short stories, primarily within the nationalist discourse and the time frame that we had identified for Rabindranath Tagore and Munshi Premchand. Part 3 will deal with Mahashweta Devi, a powerful Indian voice. The tradition of storytelling amongst women is really an ancient one, and while talking about it earlier, we had pointed out that there are contexts of narration that determine the nature of the tale also. For women, quite often it is within the domestic framework that they have narrated stories as grandmothers, mothers, sisters, and usually slightly elderly people. There are also ritual tales, Vrata Kathas. I want to add to that a little bit by showing you very briefly examples of other ritual forms which also include storytelling, but in an extremely different way. We do want to keep in mind this observation that was made by the editors of the anthology of short stories, that the modern Indian short story owes more to oral traditions and folk tales than it does to the ancient texts. As you recall, our focus is on the short story, and therefore, these oral tales seem to hold greater significance for the modern short story also. The connection between folk tales in general and women oriented folk forms in particular and the modern short story by women authors needs deeper investigation. This relationship has been investigated, and I think the important study of Tharu and Lalita does talk about it, but I think it has not been followed sufficiently because there is such rich diversity that is available in our framework that I think these overlaps really need to be undertaken in multiple ways by lots and lots of scholars and thinkers. The cultural implications, however, of this interrelationship has been a hallmark of IPTA and the progressive writers movement, who around the time of Indian independence had really quite consciously promoted the exploration of folk forms, because these were seen as people's forms, and often the bridge between urban and rural, between men and women, between people in the mainstream and those on the margins, this was circumvented by exploration of folk forms and foregrounding them as either dramatic works or as short stories. So, this has been a thriving tradition, but I think we need to really carry this forward more vigorously. It has been fascinating while researching this particular angle to recognize that the omnipresence of imagination, and to me this is really captured most powerfully and in terms of the paradoxes of a very restrictive situation and the leaps of imagination that you see in Satyajit Ray's Pathar Panchali, where this lone woman, old woman, she narrates the tales to these kids, and at the same time she can whip up her imagination and withdraw at the same time very quickly, because she knows that the ground reality does not really permit her too much leeway. So, have a look at this just to understand and appreciate the presence of this fecund quality everywhere.
এমন সময় কসম একটা লাভ কষিয়ে হাউ হাউ খাও মানুষের গন্ধ কম আমার মন্দিরে কে জাগে রে, নীল কমল ফুল আর লাল কমল জাগে। তারপরে আবার দুপুরের সময় আবার রাক্ষসী এলো, মানুষের গন্ধ কম আমার মন্দিরে কে জাগে রে, নীল কমল জাগে। আচ্ছা,
The other example I am really tempted to share is that of Sanja rituals that are practiced in Madhya Pradesh, Bihar, Punjab. But the one that I have seen, I just want to place two examples before you in order to show to you how actually story writing within the oral tradition or within the folk tradition has been also part and parcel not only of ritualistic practice, but also ritualistic practice where there are these paradoxical elements where women find a mode of expression and at the same time their objective condition really pulls them down. So, this is a very interesting, sad, but very rich trajectory. And in Sanja also, if you can see this mural that I have selected for you. Have a look at this mural. I am placing this before you. You can see these young girls who are making this mural, and these are all adolescent girls. And if you see the mural itself, it's a really rich depiction of rich representation of forms that they cherish, both natural and maybe some of the social ones. This I think again has a story element. After the mural, I'd also like to show you this embroidered version of Sanja. I myself have embroidered it, and basically again you see the prominence given to Sanja, and also the moon, the stars, the birds, other friends, and the desire to move on. Basically there are just so many narratives here, and each one varies with the individual. So, this is another version of Sanja for you. So, the stories that circulate, they circulate in so many different ways, and again to get you a sense of that story, I will read a very small part of my play A Dream in Three Acts, in which part 2 this story is evoked, and the story is about Sanja again. Sanja, the ritual, actually refers to this evening hour, this period of transition between day and night. It also refers to the period of transition between childhood and youth, and it's a very girl centered ritual. And the stories that are created here, some of them are very intriguing, and at the same time some of them are meant to evoke a kind of terror in the minds of these young girls, so that they won't really transgress the social boundaries very much. So, this particular story, it tells Sanja, that is every young girl who is a Sanja, moving from childhood to adolescence and youth. This is how it goes. Go home, Sanja, or your mother will beat you to punish your misdemeanor. She will push you in the grinding mill. The moon has disappeared towards Gujarat, and the deer has grown ominous tusks. Go home, Sanja. Now, of course, the notion of the story, we want to keep that as a very enlarged notion, because in the folk tradition it is a loosely structured story, and the story is here, it revolves around Sanja, the imagined being, and also the kind of surreal images that are evoked here are meant to frighten Sanja, and also the mother and daughter relationship is also problematized, because the mother is the one who would really control the behavior of this young girl. So, in other words, there are a whole lot of very, very complex, but visually rich and paradoxical forms that are already available, and maybe we need to see the interrelationship between them and the modern short story carefully. because in terms of the modern short story, the very term modern really describes certain tendencies which are really very, very different from the folk forms. So, if we were to actually take some of the ideas from Susie Tharu and K. Lalita's women writing in India, they actually trace a tradition, and so maybe that tradition will help us understand the modern short story better. First of all, in addition to the folk forms, there has been some kind of a tradition of writing by women that they have researched and talked about, which starts from 600 BC, and let us see what they have to point out. They mention Therigatha in the 80 BC as an important milestone in the tradition of women's writing. It is very important for every writer to really seek a sense of connection with the past, and in that sense it is very well known that women have tried to locate their traditions that have been lost in the mist of history. So, from that point of view, this trajectory is a very important one. Then in terms of 1930s to 1950s, I think if we try to match that period which we had identified earlier, we do see the emergence of women writers, which means writers who published their work, writers who were read. And what I would actually right now do is to request Neha to respond to the stories that she has identified from this period, so that you will begin to see the content of this story. And also, before I give you my analytical comments, you will be able to appreciate the content and the historical context of these stories. So, from the folk forms, we move to the modern short story.
Hi, I will be talking about two women writers from Susie Tharu and K. Lalita's anthology of women writing in India from 600 BC to early 20th century. These stories and write-ups about the writers you will find in their first volume. I am going to talk about Homvati Devi, who was a short story writer and a poet. She has 4 collections of short stories to her credit and 2 of poetry. She took up writing seriously at the age of 23 when she became a young widow. Initially, she felt handicapped at her lack of formal education, but with encouragement from other people, she began writing and read her first story out to an audience of fellow writers at Nauchandi Mela in 1939. Her home, which was in Meerut, soon became a gathering place for writers and intellectuals of the time, and Susie and Tharu claimed that perhaps the debates that took place on the lawns of her house may well have changed the course of Hindi literature. So, I am going to move on to the next slide. Her writing is marked by an eye for detail and a feel for everyday pains, the unexpected joys, and the searing humiliation experienced by middle class women, particularly in the domestic sphere. She experimented in her short stories much more than she was able to experiment in her poetry. Therefore, I think her short stories provide a realistic account of law and other institutions of the state as experienced by women. Now, most of the information that I have gathered is from this anthology. I went on the internet and tried to check out whether there were photos of Homvati Devi and the other author that I am going to discuss, but I did not find any. So, I thought the lacuna of information available on the internet was quite telling in this regard. This story that I am going to read out is titled Apna Ghar. It appeared in 1935 for the first time, but ultimately it is now a part of a collection of stories under the same name. The story deals with Uma, a young widow, and her travails at her cousin brother's home while she awaits a verdict on the property dispute after her husband's death. Now, I am going to present a few excerpts from the story. The story is translated by Manisha Chaudhary and it is on page number 438 of the anthology. So, Uma came from a well-to-do family and now she is a young widow of 22 and she has come to her cousin brother's home and she is quite upset about the humiliation that she has to face. So, here is the excerpt. When Neelam returned at noon, he had a high fever. His clothes and books were soaked. When Uma asked how it had happened, he burst into tears. Amma, let us not live here anymore. Let us go home to father. Uma's heart broke when she heard him. Home. There is no home. Father, he will not come back now. Where should I take you? You study hard and grow up fast. Only then we will have our own home. And she was lost in painting a vision of the future. Neelam, his wife, his children, servants, cows, milk, curd, and our home. All this began unfolding like a series of moving pictures in her imagination. It touched her pain. Some strand of hope for the morrow transported her to another world. It was as if she were not the young woman of 22, but a 50-year-old mistress of a prosperous household. And she was bathed in the glow of love and contentment. When Neelam said, Amma, I'm cold. The reason that I chose this excerpts from this story and I chose this story in particular is because the question of what is one's home and what makes a place or a space that we can call home, it's a question that everybody, even now in today's age when more women are working and more women are out there earning, are still concerned about what makes a safe place, what makes a home, and what kind of environment do you end up calling a place of your own. So now I will move on to the other writer whom I also found very interesting. This is a writer, is a young Telugu writer who was interested in the social reform movement of the time, and she was active between early 20s and late 20s and early 30s. Unfortunately, she died in 1931 because of a bout of pneumonia and she was only 24 years old. Regardless of that, she has done a lot of work in her lifetime. She was intensely involved with the idea of building a women's movement. She worked for dance girls and supported widow remarriage. Darasi Annapurnamma also encouraged women to get an education and fight discrimination. She was a representative of Andhra at the 1929 All India Women's Conference. And she was one of the few women to participate in the salt satyagraha led by Gandhi in 1930. Darasi Annapurnamma's stories are rendered in a humorous and colloquial style, and they are about superstitions and blind belief and women's place in the family as well as male domination. She has written extensively on the law of divorce, on parda, on remarriage, etc. This story that I am going to read is called Gyanamba, and it's a story about charlatans who pose as holy men and exploit gullible men. Gyanamba is a woman, is a daughter-in-law in the household in which the story is placed, and she is very astute and protests the exploitation by these holy men and ultimately ends up setting up her own life. The story is translated by K. Lalitha and Vasant Kannabiran, and it is on page number 452 of the anthology. What I find very intriguing in the story is that along with her courage and her spirit, it ends with the line where the husband is ultimately permitting her to set up a house for the old and the poor, and when she has already done so many things on her own with her own money. So I thought that I would point out this contradiction to you and end the presentation. Thank you so much.
After listening to Neha's contextualization and reading of the excerpts, I think it would be fairly clear to you that these stories do provide a sense of the inner changes that occurred in women's lives in decolonized India. That it was a really a fairly radical change in their lives, and from the anonymity of restrictive folk forms, they moved towards modern discourse based on challenging naturalized assumptions about women and society. And I think that is the component of modernity that the short story reflects. That is, you really explore a new point of view, a new way of articulating experience, and even if the pre-givens are well known, your own inner perception of this reality, this is what these stories are all about. And I would also like to add that when we talk about the nationalist discourse, then we have to remember that indeed the nationalist discourse was not only about building dams and bridges and national scientific and technological institutions, but it was also about the sense of greater participation of women and other marginalized groups in improving their lives. With this idea in mind, we will now move to Mahashweta Devi. So, this is the third part of our presentation titled Mahashweta Devi, a powerful Indian voice. You may have already heard about Mahashweta Devi. She has written novels, short stories, plays, essays, and she really has engaged very vigorously with the Indian cultural and political scene. She has been labeled as a writer activist, and in particular she has written about the complex sensibility of the tribals and also the nomadic tribes, and fought against their marginalization. And in order to understand this, I would like you to read her essay titled Tribal Languages and Literature, the Need for Recognition. So, she has not only explored the life of the tribals by interacting with them, by watching them, by feeling really engaged in their lives, and at the same time she has also written about their issues, their problems, in order to make a difference both on the legal scene and in terms of the political scenario in India. So, this is a very different kind of a writer and a very powerful one. In this particular essay, she argues for the rightful recognition of tribal languages and literature to restore their participation in the national discourse. She feels like I suppose every right thinking intellectual, that it's not sufficient to only deal with the political aspect, but also it is important to recognize the cultural sensibility of different groups, and the tribals have had a very long history of being part of our natural self or natural environment, and therefore, it is very important to understand their own voices properly, and in that sense their languages need to be recognized and their literature needs to be recognized also. The story that we have chosen for sharing with you is Rudali, and this has been translated into English. We will also refer to its interpretation for stage and cinematic interpretation. So, now let us look at the story Rudali, and again the perspective in which we want to place this material is this whole long trajectory of Indian women writers. We do not want this to be a restrictive label, but at the same time there are significant issues associated with women, and in this story, interestingly, the protagonist is a woman and the writer is also a woman, but they belong to two very different classes. So far as the writer's position is concerned, this has been written from the third person point of view. So, the narrator is an omniscient narrator, and from time to time the narrator describes the life of the protagonist Sanichari, and at the same time gives deep sense of the complex problems that really made life very difficult for the rest of the villagers also. So, both these things are balanced out in Rudali. In order to give you a feel for this story, let me just read parts of it. Let me start with the first part. In Tahar village, Ganjus and Dushards were in the majority. Sanichari was a Ganju by caste. Like the other villagers, her life too was lived in desperate poverty. Her mother-in-law used to say, it was because Sanichari was born on inauspicious Saturday that her destiny was full of suffering. At that time, Sanichari was a young daughter-in-law. She wasn't free to speak up. Later on, the narrator describes Sanichari's inability to cry on the death of loved ones due to the harsh conditions of her life, and also the villagers had the same fate. So, let me read this particular excerpt where the narrator says, in this village everyone is unhappy. They understand suffering, so they are content with being fed just sour curd, sugar and coarse parched rice. Everyone understands the fact that Sanichari and her husband don't shed any tears. How is it possible to weep when you have borne 3 deaths in as many years? Their grief must have hardened into stone within them. There are very positive things also in the village. For amongst the poor, there are some people who have better understanding of the situation, and Dulan as a character is a village elder who provides great insights and support to not only Shanichari, but to many others also. Shanichari's life takes a new turn after meeting Bhikini, a childhood friend. And I would like to read this part. It is very, very moving. They by chance saw each other in the marketplace, and this is how the narrator describes them. They settled down in the shade of a peepal tree. They eyed each other closely. Before each relaxed in the realization that the other was no better off than herself. Like Shanichari, Bikini's wrists, throat and forehead sport no jewelry other than blue tattoo marks. Both wear pieces of cork in their ears instead of earrings. Their hair is rough and ungroomed. Sanichari handed Bikini a bidi. So, then Bikini and Rudali together, they feel very empowered because they have the strength of friendship, and Dulan adds to their survival tactics by suggesting that they become Rudalis. So, this is what the narrator says. After hearing them out, Dulan said, as long as there is a way of earning, why should anyone die of starvation? What kind of earning? But Budhwa's mother, do ready-made ways of earning exist? They may exist for Malik Mahajans, but do they exist for Dushards and Ganjus? We have to make our own opportunities, and so on and so forth. And so, there is this innovative new way of wage earning that evolves. They, Shanichari and Bikini become Rudalis, and again this is how this is described by the narrator. The two of you go, wail, cry, accompany the corpse. You will get money, rice. On the day of the Kriya ceremony, you will get clothes and food. Sanichari felt an earthquake within. She exploded. Cry? Me? Don't you know? I can't shed tears. These two eyes of mine are scorched. Dulan spoke in a cold, expressionless tone. Budhua's ma, I am not asking you to shed the tears you couldn't shed for Budhua. These tears are your livelihood. You will see, just as you cut wheat and plough land, you will be able to shed these tears. Anyway, this spell of success of being Rudalis and earning their living and improving their life, this spell of success ends after Bikini's death, and towards the end of the story, Shanichari, instead of losing hope, she finds that a new sense of empowerment within her, and then this is how the story ends. So, after Bikini's death, Shanichari decides to call whole lot of discarded women to become Rudalis and change and improve their life, and this is what finally happens. All of them become Rudalis, and there is a particular scene where somebody has died, one of the landlords has died, and they are crying their heart out. And I am reading the last few lines of the story. The Kumashta began to weep tears of sorrow. Nothing will be left. Cunning Shanichari. Hitting their heads meant they had to be paid double. He and the nephew were reduced to helpless onlookers. While hitting her head on the ground and wailing loudly, Gulbadan turned her dry eyes in the direction of the nephew, cast him a leering wink and grinned. Then, listening to Shanichari's cry, she rejoined the chorus. So, that was a Rudali for you, and what we would like you to do is to have a look at this stage version directed by Usha Ganguly, in which she emphasized the sisterhood of all these women and their garb as Rudalis, which is very dark and austere, actually it contrasts with the sense of empowerment that it gives them, and this is a new mode of wage earning as such. So, have a look at this stage version, and I think you will enjoy the text in your own way. You can have your own interpretation, and you can also then after Usha Ganguly's interpretation, you can also have a look at the cinematic clip. Usha Ganguly is one of the major directors of our country, and she has also an activist aspect of her work. She loves to take on challenging subjects and seeks to grow in the process, and her growth as a director is rooted in reaction and response to all forces that inhibit humanity. This is from her website, and in the process of reading the play, you will also get to understand how different writers, thinkers, theatre directors, film directors, how they have looked at these issues and these scripts. So, here is the photo study, very paradoxical, and then we move on to the cinematic interpretation of the story. Now, in the cinematic interpretation by Lajmi, the rugged aspect of Shanichari's life seems to be muted, and the imagined romance between Shanichari and the landlord, I tend to feel that it is unduly emphasized, but you can have your own take. It becomes something else in the hands of another creative person.
मन को लगे नैना इसको दिखाऊं ओ मोरे चंद्रमा तेरी चांदनी अंग जलाए ऊंची तोर अटारी.
After looking at the film and after watching the photo study of Rodali, what we would like you to do is to consider some of the questions, critical questions that we would like you to consider while judging your own ability to read the script carefully. So, these are the questions that we have placed before you. This we have been doing earlier also, and I think a critical analysis is a very important part of creative writing. So, then these are the questions, you can have a look at it. Specify the names of all the characters who appear in the story. Describe the historical period of the piece based on references made within the text. Explain the significance of the title with reference to the writer's point of view. Comment on the distinctive features of the literary genre, the short story. Assess the overall literary impact of the chosen text on you as a reader. Critically examine your reading of Indian literature. Define the term Indian literature. Based on the reading of Rodali, compare and contrast the stage and or film version in highlighting the travails and the strengths of the marginalized. Now, this is an issue that we have been raising right from the beginning, that we need to hear the voices of the marginalized. So, I think this is a very important question from that point of view, because I think Mahashweta Devi has this rare capacity to see them as they are rather than put them in narrow categories. For works cited, here is our list, but we would also like you to consider additional reading, especially Mahashweta Devi's other short stories, which they have been translated by Gayatri Chakrabarti Spivak, and also Anjum Katyal's translation of Rodali and the book titled Rodali From Fiction to Performance. That is also a very rich study. So, that is all for this session. Thank you very much.